do put it together for a guy who is an investigative journalist, a Pulitzer Prize winner, the co-founder of DCReport.org, multiple best-selling author, and now professor at RIT. How about it for the great David K. Johnston, everybody? Wow. You are building out your resume like Kamala Harris built it out with that McDonald's reference. I love how Donald Trump talks about she has that on her resume, working at McDonald's, as though anyone would add that to anyone's resume. I mean, it's just absurd. He really is. He's becoming increasingly unhinged.
Yes, well, she doesn't have any records to prove she worked at McDonald's, but Donald doesn't have any to prove he delivered newspapers either.
Right. No, one was clearly born with the silver spoon, and the other not.
Well, especially if when it rains, Daddy's chauffeur drives you around in the Cadillac limousine to deliver your newspapers, which is what Tom's father allowed.
I mean, it's something out of The Simpsons. Like, if Montgomery Burns had a child, that he would, please take him around to the various houses he has to deliver the paper. So we'll circle back to J.D. Vance, who will be on this debate stage tonight opposite Tim Walz. And we'll circle back to, I consider him an extremely dangerous person, and I know you do as well. And in fact, you've kind of pointed me in the direction of a couple of things that are even more alarming than some of the things I was already aware of. I'll double back to that, but I know you care a lot, and I feel like this is lost in a lot of what's going on in the Middle East right now, the conflict in Ukraine. You've commented on it before, and I wonder if you could bring us up to speed on how you assess that situation now.
Well, the Ukrainians are still very much the underdogs here. They've been able to hang on because they're fighting for their homeland and their freedom. But the Russian government budget was just put out, and it shows that Vladimir Putin intends to spend more than 41% of the budget on military matters. Now, the budget broadly defines military just as we do. That would include intelligence, security, and prosecuting the war. To give you an idea of how much of a strain that would be on the one-note Russian economy, which is it's just an oil and gas economy. And we have, of course, heavy sanctions forcing them to sell a lot of oil at well below market prices through devious means. During World War II, the peak year of our spending was 1944, and it was about 40% of our economy. We had severe rationing. There were sugar rations and food rations and gasoline and rubber rations, and all sorts of things had to shut down to feed the war machine. So Putin is really putting the squeeze to his people as his economy is deeply squeezed. The Russians have scored one big victory recently. A missile strike took out apparently 4 of the F-16 fighters Zelensky has sought from the beginning. Those planes cost more than $60 million each. Apparently, the Ukrainians only have 4 of them left. They have proven to be tremendously effective. And on the Russian side, the Russians have a plane that's like our AWACS. AWACS are those Boeing jets you see with the huge dome atop them. Looks like a flying saucer. They're surveillance planes with very sophisticated radar and other telecommunications. And the Russians called their plane the A-50. They apparently are down to 6 of them. There's an image, yes. 6 of them, one of which we think is in Syria. And they've had to pull them back so that instead of being able to fly over the Azov Sea and get right up on the edge of Ukraine, they've had to pull them way back. The Ukrainians have proved very effective at something the German army taught them called shoot and scoot. In the middle of the night or over several nights, you set up a missile launcher. You wait for the Russians to bring a plane like the A350 into your range. You take that plane out, and then you, as fast as you can, dismantle the launcher you built and get out of there before you're hit by a missile. So, the Ukrainian military tactics and strategy are going to be studied in war colleges as long as human beings have war, which I hope is not forever, but certainly will exist through your and my lifetimes. And
Yeah, I'm sorry to
They've
interrupt. Go ahead.
proven brilliant at strategy, but they're still on the downside. And of course, Putin is just waiting for the election November 5th, because if Trump gets back to the White House, he wins. If Trump doesn't get back to the White House, his chances of winning diminish severely.
So again, I'll get to Trump and J.D. Vance, et cetera, in a second, but let me just quickly follow up. The Russian goal, David K. Johnston, at the beginning of things, their incursion into Ukraine, was it just to destabilize and make this a less than viable country in terms because they saw them as a West-leaning democracy, right? It was really an issue for Putin that they had clearly affections for the West. Was his goal just to destabilize them, put them in this kind of endless war and conflict? And so in that sense, he's won, or was it to actually take Ukraine as a territory?
Oh, it was to take Ukraine, and he thought in a matter of days or weeks, Ukraine would crumble. And Putin has been very clear. You can read his words as I have. He believes the worst thing that happened in the 20th century wasn't Nazism or Mao's purges or Stalin's purges. It was the breakup of the old Soviet empire, the Kremlin and its satellites. And he's very clear that he intends to, if he can, go in and put all these countries, Poland, the Baltic states, Moldova, Hungary, well, I don't know about Hungary because he's got a friendly ally there, but Slovakia, etc., under the boot of the Kremlin. And were something to happen to Putin, the next logical person in line is even more ardent than he is about this idea that this is Russia's territory and that if it will use force. So it's imperative, if we want to avoid decades of warfare in Europe, that Putin be defeated, not just brought to a standstill, but defeated in Ukraine.
You're seeing the special military operation that would take Kyiv in 5 days was sort of the expectation on the Russian side. It's funny when we show the maps of Ukraine and you see Crimea, it brings me back to the Crimea seizing that really went I don't want to say we didn't respond, but there was, David, it felt as though our response was tepid, perhaps. But I'm wondering what you review. I think I've asked you this question before, so pardon me. But I wonder if you could review for us again what you felt would have been an appropriate response to the taking of Crimea.
Well, let's go back just a little before Crimea. There was a Russian puppet who was running the Ukrainian government. He was a kleptocrat. He built this enormous presidential palace that was behind a wall, deeply behind a wall. He's a huge compound. So the people of Ukraine didn't know about it. I mean, there were rumors around he had done something, but they had no idea until they rose up in February of 2014, broke into the place. There was a desperate effort to hide the records. They threw them into this artificial lake, and people trained by investigative reporters and editors, which I used to be the president of as a volunteer, knew what to do. They grabbed those papers and had them flash frozen. And ultimately, we found out that Donald Trump's campaign manager 2 years later, Paul Manafort, was paid off with tens of millions of dollars. And we don't know all he was paid. We just know the records they were able to grab and save. Right after this happened, Putin decided he needed to take Crimea, part of Ukraine, because he needed a warm water port. Although it's not a completely free port, he has to put his ships through the Bosporus Strait to get them into the Mediterranean. And a whole bunch of soldiers appeared in Crimea. They had no insignia. And Putin said, "Oh, I don't know who those people are. I have no idea who they are." Sort of like Donald Trump doesn't know what Project 2025 is, even though he blessed it when it was launched. And once he'd seized Crimea, he, of course, said, "Of course they were my soldiers." So Crimea is strategically important to the Russian Navy, but it's not Russia's territory. And the Ukrainians are pretty close to being able to cut off support for Crimea. They have forced the Russian fleet away from Sevastopol and to pull way back. And remember, the Black Sea is so big, it's roughly the size of California and Nevada. I mean, it is enormous. It's much, much bigger than the Great Lakes, where I live. And so there's no legitimate Russian claim to this. But Ukraine has about a quarter of the population, less than a quarter of the population of Russia. And so the Ukrainians are very much on the defensive here. And they've invaded now a significant portion of Russia, and Putin has not gone to go after them for doing so, which tells you a lot about his disregard for the Russian people and his lust to expand his power into other states. Obviously, I think quite clearly on the theory that we'll get back our Russian territory later.
I see. Yeah, it's the long game.
Right.
And so I come back to it, though, David. Should we have acted in some kind of stronger way when that Crimea takeover happened?
I apologize. I
loved it. I just learned a lot. I just learned a lot, so I'm good with it.
I think Obama made a very serious mistake by not being much tougher at the time. What others have written about who cover Washington from up close, whereas I covered from afar, is that Congress would not support him. He had complete opposition from the Republican Party and tepid support from Democrats, some of whom were against any action to protect Crimea. And in many ways, Obama was didn't have a particularly strong mandate. I mean, he got, thanks to Nancy Pelosi, his big legislation through, the Affordable Care Act. But he wasn't able to accomplish a lot of other things because he was in a relatively weak position. The other NATO countries, I think, should have taken a much tougher stance on this. What you don't want to do is have NATO troops in a shooting war with the Russians. That's a prescription for disaster. The Ukrainians are going to have to do this themselves. We can give them weaponry. And one important thing you're hearing in the debate all the time is we're giving billions of dollars to Zelensky. Well, we're not giving Zelensky hardly any cash at all. You could argue that, in fact, what we're doing is creating jobs in America. The munitions that are being fired off by the Ukrainians, the aircraft, the tanks, the very sophisticated electronic surveillance is being made in America, paid for by American taxpayers, but creating American jobs and then given to the Ukrainians.
Interesting. And at the end of all of that, the reality is David's essentially saying that there wasn't the political will and a clear political runway to respond to the taking over of Crimea. So now to domestic politics and tonight's face-off between Vance and Walz. And, you forget, because the news cycle has such a voracious appetite, you forget all the stuff that's come out about J.D. Vance. He wrote the foreword of that guy's book, the extreme right-wing religious nut job. He wrote his foreword. He's endorsed all of these extremely fascistic kinds of notions about government and about essentially purging government of all these federal employees, of dismantling a lot of these government agencies. This very much speaks to the essence of who he is, but we forget it. But you pointed out that he follows a guy who's an anarchical figure. He's a rallying point for a lot who feel we need to get rid of the American government completely, and we need to go to the only way to really reboot America and American culture and politics is to go to a dictatorial system, but just that you have to pick the right dictatorial people. Isn't that essentially where J.D. Vance is?
Oh, I think it's even worse than you put it, and that's pretty damn awful. Back in 2015, 9 years ago, I was trying to warn people that Donald Trump would be our dictator if he got to the White House. And he simply wasn't competent the first time around. He now has a team all set to make him dictator. Now, Rachel Maddow last night spent almost 12 minutes in a segment which, sorry, I don't mean to take people away from your show, but I would encourage your audience, go to an internet search engine and just type in Maddow, Vance, and limit it for the last 24 hours. And on YouTube, you'll see for free this almost 12-minute segment from the Rachel Maddow show. Now, what she has is not new in the sense that stories about this have appeared in Politico, the New York Times, Vox, elsewhere. But the way she put her package together is very powerful. Vance is the follower, in a philosophical sense, of a fellow who says that we should fire every single federal government employee. We need to remove from power, and he doesn't say whether he means violently or otherwise, but we need to remove everybody in power, both parties, clean them out. We need to replace the president with a dictator. And that dictator should have the power to shut down any company he doesn't like. And he says that all the universities should be seized through eminent domain, and then the universities sold off to real estate developers. By the way, one of the reasons this country is so rich is our incredible higher education system that people all over the world come here to participate in. There's plenty of economics research showing that since World War II, roughly 2/3 of our economic growth is the result of the advances in science, most of which take place not in corporations, they do applied work, but at universities. And so what you're seeing here is a man running to become vice president of the United States who does not believe in democracy, cannot honestly take the oath to be vice president, is violating his oath as a United States senator. And he's also someone who believes that not only should abortion be banned, but women who are in violently abusive marriages should be required to stay in those marriages. This man is so far out in space compared to where the American public is. Now, I don't know how successful we'll see those issues successfully raised in the debate tonight. Vance, after all, is a lawyer, and his style and that of Governor Tim Walz are very different. But I certainly hope this issue of Vance is an anarchist at heart. He supports and recommends to people those who are calling for effectively the overthrow of the United States government, its replacement with a dictatorship run by an all-powerful CEO. I hope people grasp this. I don't understand people who say, I don't see a big difference between the candidates. You can turn on the TV and you'll see this all the time. Oh, I don't know, there's not that much difference, is there? My goodness, there's a complete difference. One of them believes in the rule of law and democracy and liberty, and one of them wants a dictatorship where the president has the freedom to to go to an extreme example that will happen if we become a dictatorship, firing squads.
Well, he could do it with the kind of cover he's been given by the Supreme Court. I mean, the president could do any number of things. I think his desire, of course, is to money himself, isn't it? I mean, I kind of went to school on your books, and that's basically his motivating. He's ego and money is what I would boil him down to.
I would say it's ego and money. I mean, Donald really believes, and has believed for at least the 36 years I've known him, that he's the only person who's fit to run the country, to be president. No one else is fit. And I'm sure if you could press him far enough, he'd say J.D. Vance isn't fit. He needs to do it. I don't know what he thinks is going to happen after he dies, because he's 78 years old now and he's not going to live forever. But Donald's ego, if he hadn't been elected president of the United States, you could say that he has delusions of grandeur. Since he got himself to the White House through the Electoral College and with a lot of help from the Russians and other foreign governments, I don't think you can quite say those are delusions. He got there. But if he gets back, this time he has a team that intends to overthrow this government as we know it. And when you hear J.D. Vance talk about the republic and it needs to be completely wiped out and rebuilt, he's talking about the ancient Roman Republic, which took somewhere between 40 and 60 years to morph into a dictatorship, and what he wants to do today.
And, David, what I noticed so much with J.D. Vance, and, it's funny, the Maddow thing, I saw it and I was going to run a little bit of it. The audio is a little tough to hear, which is why I didn't want to run it on this show. But I do underscore what you said, which is people should find it. The first 12 minutes of Maddow is really powerful.
Maddow Vance, last 24 hours, a video will pop right up.
Yeah, Maddow Vance. But what I was going to say is they kind of they disguise it in this new verbiage and the kind of a branding, which is sort of the ruling elite, the government elite, they make it sound as though you go, yeah, well, I don't want the ruling elite to take control of this. If you refer enough to government as the ruling elite, government seems as though they're the enemy. And of course, Reagan had the famous line about the scariest words you can hear are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." If you're from the federal government, I'm here to help you. But the reality is, government does a lot of good stuff, and dismantling these various institutions of government will have a catastrophic effect on this country. I mean, just even the dismantling without the despotism, I see it as a sad, sad moment that it would even be considered as a serious eventuality.
Yeah, and a lot of things in government we need desperately. I'll give you an example I used when I taught the law of the ancient world. I would say, all right, we're the village of classroom 440. And one of you makes food products, and we all got sick from your food products. Well, we can take care of that. We can shun you. We can make somebody else make them. We can give you a bad time. And if you do it again and again, we can get more and more serious. And if you suddenly kill several of us because of your not practicing proper procedures, we may kill you. In a small society of one village, you can do that. You buy an item of food in the grocery store, there may be components in it that came from 100 different places. The seasonings, the substance of it, certainly very common for it to come from a dozen places. If you buy hamburger made by one of the big companies that control about 85% of the beef market, there is cattle from hundreds and hundreds of cows. And if there's listeria in it, it's going to ruin tons of this food, and listeria can kill you. The reason every can of food has a coded stamp on it, impressed into the metal, is the food authorities, the FDA, they can use that to trace back to where and when that canister or a metal can was filled with food, and figure out from the business records what needs to be done to save lives. So you need regulation in a global economy and a national economy on many levels to protect public health. And it isn't necessarily that people making food are intentionally doing bad things. Screw-ups happen. Bad practices happen. We just saw with the Boar's Head case where complete mismanagement of a plant, where there was mold and all sorts of other things that shouldn't be there because the plant manager wasn't doing his job. Maybe he didn't have the budget to do his job. But that plant shut down. But if we don't have food regulation, many more people will die than do die from bad foods. And that's just one of many, many examples of where some regulation is necessary. And of course, most regulatory rules are written by industry to benefit industry. They're not written by consumers.
Yeah, you start with a compromise to begin with, but consumer protections fall into that category, environmental protections. I mean, the toxic waste that's dumped into water, air, soil. These are all things that need to be regulated. If you leave it to corporate self-policing, it just won't happen. We've seen it over and over and over, from Deepwater Horizon to a slurry that falls into some West Virginia stream. The GOP would get rid of the FDA, and how many Americans would get very ill or die from food poisoning? Yeah, I mean, that's just one example.
In 1906, Mark, Congress passed the Food and Drug Act because of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which he had hoped would improve conditions of the workers. He wasn't so worried about the safety of the food. But a lot of Americans think, well, that's when we began regulating food safety. No, that's not true. Congress passed an 1890 meat inspection law, but it only applied to American meat and beef and poultry and chicken, and the pork being exported to Europe, because Europeans were saying, oh, you can't buy American meat. It's not safe. So, of course, industry got a regulatory law passed to help them with their sales to Europe. They weren't worried about Americans. They were worried about Europe. So remember that most regulations are written by companies, and they're designed to further the interests of those companies, which include not killing people en masse.
All right, you are the dean of Trumpologists, so I can't let you go without a quick word about what's going on in this. Look at you, Tony. What was that, Tony? That was
Cover
that
of
was
Puck.
that's very impressive. Is that from what? The Pure Food and Drug Act. Very nicely done.
Very quickly done, Tony.
Yeah, Tony is he's a ninja. Now I need you to ninja something else for David K. Johnston, if you would, and that is the Trump statements. Give me the McDonald's first, and then I want to play him the mashup, and then I'll let him go. But I just really can't have you here without asking you about the increasing, it would seem almost desperation that Trump is displaying as he makes things up. By the way, and then I'll play this, he's got it rallied, but I'll just want to mention in the context of today, which is the hurricane damage, he's completely invented the idea that Joe Biden never called the governor of Georgia, never called the governor of North Carolina, I think he actually said. And he said, but they've made no effort to get in touch. I can't understand. It's reprehensible. There's never been anything like it. How terrible, et cetera. Well, of course, Joe Biden did call him. He called him right away and said, anything you need, the federal government is here to cover you. Go ahead and run the little bit as well of this.
This is to write it. We don't want to hear Kamala's fake promises, even something like she worked very long and hard hours over French fries at McDonald's. She never worked at McDonald's. It was a fake story. It was a fake story. The press now refuses to write it because it's so, there's a very simple one. She said she worked at McDonald's and she didn't. Not highly sophisticated, not complicated. It was a lie. She never worked at McDonald's over the hot French fries. I think I'm going to a McDonald's in 2 weeks, actually. And I'm going to work the French fries because I will have worked longer and harder at McDonald's than she did if I do that even for half an hour.
He's really leaned in. Thanks, Tony. He's really leaned into this the way he leaned into the pets. They're eating our dogs and cats.
Well, Donald believes that anything he says is reality. He creates his own reality. And first of all, what a petty, insignificant issue for him to raise. And Donald has no problem lying. Donald lies as easily as you and I breathe, a phrase I started using 35 years ago, I think. It's just who he is. There's no truth, small t or capital T, in Donald Trump. It's whatever serves his interests. So, of course, Joe Biden called the relevant governors. There are something like 3,400 federal workers who were immediately put on planes, or if they live nearby, in vehicles, and sent to the disaster areas to work on them. And remember, Donald tried to delay and not provide aid in some of the disasters that happened in blue states when he was president. There's no sign of Joe Biden doing that. In fact, of the federal spending on projects like infrastructure, Biden's actually been putting more money into red states than blue when you control for the population of the various states. So this is just Donald just making it up. Unfortunately, tonight, CBS, in something that is not journalism, has agreed not to fact check what's said by the two sides. And you're going to hear from Vance a lot of flat out lies. I don't doubt that Walz may say something that is untrue and maybe he knows isn't true and therefore it's a lie, although nobody's nailed him yet on anything significant other than the statement he made about suggesting he had been in combat. He was training people for combat.
Right. I mean, it was
one statement in his whole
exactly.
life. J.D. Vance, there are so many false things he said. But, the people need to recognize that to Donald Trump, all that matters is the glory and the pocketbook of Donald Trump. And nothing else matters because he is this empty vessel that can never be filled with contentment or normal behavior. I mean, be very glad you're not Donald Trump. What a miserable life. A man who's lived not the Groundhog Day, but Groundhog Nightmare story.
Well, what a way to put it. Yeah, he's lived a gilded life, but in its own way, tortured. And it's funny, David, just to go back to one other thing that you mentioned in reference in relation to J.D. Vance and the dismantling of the federal government. You would have no FEMA and you would have no NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, or the NHC, the National Hurricane Center. You wouldn't have any of those things if the plans and strategies that J.D. Vance has talked about were actually implemented. Those agencies would go away, and you'd say, well, what's going to happen? They would all be privatized. That is the plan, to commercialize all of those things that I've just mentioned. So in a way, it plays out this week, David, the power and the necessity of the federal government being involved.
I was channel flipping in my car, and I heard somebody on a right-wing radio station say that we don't need to have these things. They mentioned, I think it was NOAA, the National Atmospheric and Oceanographic Service. Well, technically that's true. We could get rid of NOAA, and then instead of you're having a warning that you've got 36 or 24 hours to board up your place and get the heck out of there, you just die. So no, we don't need to have it if we're just willing to accept the cost of doing that. These are choices, and there are thoughtful choices and there are thoughtless choices. And Project 2025 is about thoughtless choices on steroids.
Thank you for spending time with us today. There are a bunch of, there it is. There'll be a QR code for live checking the facts in the vice presidential debate tonight. But apart from that, there'll be no fact checking by the moderators, as David was saying. Yeah. All right. David, we shall sift through the ashes when we visit again. I'm just looking, of course, you get incredible agreement in the chat. I don't think Vance has any agenda except for more power. Vance is a fascist. Project 2025, in a nutshell, no more freedom, no more liberty, no more democracy, no more America. And then something that you referred to once before from Jean, she says, I'm hoping Trump loses by 8 to 10 million votes this time. You said you think he could lose by 10 million votes this time, I think.
I said when Biden was the candidate that the popular vote would go to Biden by at least 10 million votes. I'll be surprised if the margin isn't 15 million votes.
Oh, geez,
but
crazy
work. That doesn't mean that Kamala Harris becomes president because it's about the Electoral College. One thing I would caution people about, there have been a number of polls that have shown big shifts from week to week in different polls. That doesn't happen. It is further evidence that that what I told you a couple of weeks ago about John Geraci, the pollster, saying you can't rely on polls when fewer than 1 in 100 people who answer the phone will answer the questions. No matter how carefully the weighting is done, so you have the right number of white males over the age of 50 and black married women below the age of 40, things like that. When only 1 in 100 or 1 in even 200 people are answering the questions, there's some self-selection process going on that isn't a random sample, and I think that's why you're seeing this volatility that shouldn't be there in the polls. The issue, what is it, 5 weeks from today?
Right.
The issue is, do the Democrats get the vote out or do the Republicans get the vote out in those states? Because that's what the election is about. Who gets the vote out in 7 states?
Yeah, and as you say, it comes down to so few people that, a handful of people can throw two things. They can throw a poll and they can also throw an election, one way or the other.
One other thing, Mark, I was on the air earlier today overseas. I do a fair amount of overseas TV these days. And there was a Trump surrogate on. And I brought up the idea that Vance has advanced along with his philosophy advisor that we should seize all the universities and shut them down because they're what's corrupt and wrong with America. And the representative for Vance said, oh, that would be wonderful. I'm looking at all that real estate in Columbia University in Manhattan, the money to be made off seizing that university's land. I mean, this is the kind of mentality of people who have no thought about society, freedom, liberty. It's all about me and my pocketbook. And by the way, the rich would be worse off if you do this.
Oh, because you're saying the system would be over on its side, the markets would be roiling. Yeah, I mean,
we're creating new products, we're putting forth new scholars in every field imaginable, advancing knowledge. None of that would be happening. We would become a poor country.
Oh, closing the universities, I see. Yeah, that's absurd. It's utter absurdity, but it's plus it's a moneymaker, and you'd end up with, because those moneyed interests would make it clear, hey, you're not going to touch this system. This is our system, and but they'd get their hand in it one way or the other. It's scary. I mean, Project 2025 is truly scary. I don't know to what extent they could actually execute, but if they actually take over Washington, as you suggested, they're ready to go. They're poised to move, unlike the last time.
That's right.
It's an alarming notion. So, all right, sir, I'll let you go. Always love talking to you. David K. Johnston, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.